It was a crisp autumn morning in a suburban neighborhood that looked like it had been pulled straight from a magazine. Rows of identical houses, freshly mowed lawns, and a quiet street lined with maples swaying gently in the morning breeze. The sun barely kissed the horizon, sending a golden glow over the dewy grass. To anyone else, it was the perfect picture of suburban peace. But for Calvin Dunmore, it was a battlefield, one that started in the most unexpected way. Calvin had only moved here a few months ago after years of hard work, late nights in front of his laptop, and scrimping every paycheck. He had finally bought his dream home, a little white house with dark shutters, a porch just big enough for a rocking chair, and a front yard he was proud of. He envisioned weekends filled with barbecues, kids playing, and neighbors waving hello. He never imagined, not for a second, that he would have to defend that yard like it was Fort Knox. The first time it happened, Calvin had been inside, sipping his morning coffee, unpacking boxes still stacked in the living room. He heard a screech of tires, sharp, sudden, like a warning. He rushed to the window, and his stomach sank. A white SUV, the kind you see in those reality TV shows about entitled neighbors, was barreling through his freshly manicured lawn. The wheels tore over the grass, leaving long, angry brown streaks cutting through the green. And then it was gone, disappearing down the street like it hadn't just ruined hours of work. It didn't take long for Calvin to notice a pattern. The same vehicle, the same driver, a woman, middle-aged, blonde, impeccably dressed, sunglasses perched on her head, giving off a sense of entitlement that practically radiated from her. Calvin had started calling her Karen in his head, not knowing her real name, but knowing exactly what she represented: disrespect, audacity, and an unshakable sense of superiority. At first, Calvin tried to shrug it off. Maybe she didn't see the no trespassing signs. Maybe she was in a rush. Maybe it was an accident. But as the days passed, the incidents became predictable, like clockwork. Every morning, like some cruel ritual, the tires would crunch over his grass. Every evening, he would inspect the yard, noting the damage, the flattened patches of green, the grooves cutting across his carefully planted flowers, the uneven clumps where the soil had been disturbed. One day, he finally confronted her. He marched across the street to her driveway, heart pounding, trying to keep his tone polite. "Hi," he said, nodding toward her SUV. "I noticed you've been driving through my lawn. I'd appreciate it if you didn't." She glanced at him, one eyebrow raised, lips pressed tight, like he had just interrupted her favorite TV show. "It's just a shortcut," she said dismissively, waving a hand. "No big deal." Calvin felt a rush of frustration, a mix of disbelief and anger. It wasn't just about the lawn. It was about the audacity, about feeling invisible, about knowing that, in her mind, she could do whatever she wanted because she assumed she had the right. The next week, the damage continued. Tire tracks, fresh and angry, weaving across his property like graffiti on a wall. Calvin tried speaking to her again, more firmly this time, but she brushed him off, smiling condescendingly. She even told him, with a laugh he couldn't stomach, that he was too sensitive and should just relax. It was at that moment Calvin realized something. Nothing he said would make her stop. Reason, logic, and politeness were meaningless against entitlement backed by arrogance. If he wanted his yard, and by extension, his dignity, respected, he would have to take action. Calvin spent the next few days planning carefully. Not reckless action, not revenge out of anger, strategic defense. He researched online, looking for ways to protect property without risking legal consequences or bodily harm. And then he found it. Small steel spikes designed for garden borders, not large enough to seriously injure anyone, but sharp enough to puncture a tire or make driving over them unpleasant. Perfect. On a chilly Friday evening, under the faint orange glow of the streetlights, Calvin worked in silence. His hands were steady, his mind focused. He dug small holes along the path Karen's tires had taken so many times, planting the spikes beneath the soil, then covering them with fresh dirt and carefully pressing the grass back into place. It was meticulous work, exhausting, but satisfying in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in weeks, He felt a sense of control returning. The next morning, Calvin sat on his porch, sipping coffee, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. Around 8:30, the familiar hum of a vehicle grew louder. His heart started to race. The white SUV appeared at the end of the street, and as if on cue, turned onto his yard. The tires hit the spikes. There was a sharp hiss, a crunching sound, and the SUV jolted forward unevenly. Calvin's pulse quickened. He could see her hands tighten on the steering wheel, knuckles white, as she came to a stop mid-yard. Calvin didn't move. He stayed on the porch, arms crossed, watching. He felt a strange mix of triumph and tension. This was it. The confrontation had begun, and he hadn't even said a word. Karen jumped out of the SUV, glaring at him with fury. Her heels clicked aggressively on the grass as she stormed toward him. "What did you do?" she shouted, her voice piercing and sharp. "This is illegal. You can't just set traps on your property." Calvin remained calm. "I think you should stop driving on my lawn," he said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet but firm authority. "It's my property, and I have every right to protect it." Karen's face turned bright red, a mix of anger and disbelief. She waved her arms wildly, as if she could erase the spikes with sheer force. "I'm calling the police. This is outrageous," she yelled. Calvin didn't flinch. He had anticipated this. He had documented everything, photos, videos, even timestamps of her previous trespasses. He knew the law, knew his rights. For the first time in this ongoing battle, he felt a sense of power. He wasn't a victim here. He was a homeowner defending what was rightfully his. Karen finally stomped back to her SUV, muttering threats and insults. The engine roared to life, and she drove off slowly, peering in the rearview mirror as if daring him to follow. Calvin watched until she disappeared around the corner. He sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wet grass and the morning chill. For a moment, the neighborhood seemed still again, but Calvin knew this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't let this go quietly. She had pride, anger, and influence. And now, Calvin had set the stage for something far bigger than just a lawn. Something told him that the next move would escalate. And when it did, there would be no turning back. Calvin Dunmore wasn't always a man who had to fight for respect in his own yard. Growing up in Atlanta, he learned early that hard work was the only currency that mattered. His neighborhood hadn't been perfect. There were broken streetlights, kids running wild in the summer, and too many families scraping by. But it had been full of life, laughter, and community. Calvin's parents taught him about dignity, the importance of standing up for himself, and how to treat everyone with fairness, no matter what. From a young age, Calvin was determined. He earned scholarships to attend college, worked 2 jobs to pay his way through school, and graduated with a degree in computer science. He landed a job at a growing tech company and quickly proved himself as someone who could handle pressure, who could think outside the box, and who didn't shy away from responsibility. By his early 30s, Calvin had accomplished something many people only dream of. He bought a home for his family in a quiet, well-kept suburban neighborhood, a place where he imagined stability, safety, and pride. When he first moved in, everything seemed perfect. The streets were lined with oak and maple trees that painted the neighborhood in fiery reds and golds every fall. Neighbors smiled politely during morning walks, and the air had that clean, almost antiseptic smell of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Calvin had worked hard to make the house perfect. He spent weekends mowing the lawn, planting tulips, and trimming hedges, enjoying the kind of pride only a homeowner knows. But the peace he sought didn't last. The first sign of trouble came subtly. A few weeks after moving in, Calvin noticed tire marks cutting across the grass. Shallow grooves at first, like a small nuisance he could ignore. But soon, the marks became deeper, longer, and more brazen. At first, he tried to brush it off. Perhaps a delivery truck? A neighbor's guest. But there was a pattern, and the pattern pointed to a single driver, a middle-aged woman in a white SUV, meticulously clean and impeccably dressed, who clearly didn't feel the slightest hesitation about using Calvin's lawn as her personal shortcut. Her presence was more than inconvenient. It was deliberate. The first time Calvin confronted her, he had tried to approach the situation calmly, imagining she might apologize once she realized the damage she caused. He walked across the street to her driveway, clearing his throat before knocking. She answered the door with a sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown. "Hi," Calvin began, careful with his words. "I noticed you've been driving through my yard. I'd appreciate it if you didn't." The woman raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching. "It's just a shortcut," she said, with the kind of casual dismissiveness that made Calvin's blood boil. "No big deal." Calvin felt his pulse quicken, frustration bubbling. "It's my property," he said. "I maintain it, and I'd like it respected." She laughed softly, a sound that made his skin crawl. "Calvin, you're too sensitive. It's just grass." And with that, she closed the door, leaving Calvin standing on the sidewalk, seething. That was the first confrontation, but it wouldn't be the last. Each day, the pattern repeated. Tire marks cut through his lawn, deeper and more numerous. Calvin tried different approaches. Polite notes left on her windshield, a second in-person conversation, even casual waves and smiles. Nothing worked. Karen, the name he had taken to calling her in his head, simply ignored or dismissed him, her entitlement like armor. It wasn't just a lawn anymore. It was a matter of principle, of dignity. Calvin realized he was being tested, not just as a homeowner, but as a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood where his presence alone seemed to make some uncomfortable. The stakes were higher than he first thought. Calvin considered calling the police, but he knew the truth. Complaints like this often didn't go his way. He had seen it before. Microaggressions, bias, assumptions. They weren't just annoyances. They were systemic obstacles. And if the authorities were called, he might end up looking like the aggressor, the troublemaker, the one causing issues in an otherwise peaceful community. So Calvin took matters into his own hands. He spent days researching ways to protect his property legally and safely. That's when he discovered the small steel spikes designed for gardens. He was careful. These wouldn't seriously harm anyone. They were just enough to make driving over his yard unpleasant, a defensive barrier rather than a weapon. Friday night, under the dim glow of the streetlights and a sliver of moonlight, Calvin began his careful work. He dug shallow holes along the paths where Karen had driven, placed the spikes under the soil, and pressed the grass back into place. Each spike was a quiet statement. He would not be disrespected. He worked silently, feeling both nervous and empowered. By the time he finished, his hands were sore, his back ached, but his spirit felt lighter. The next morning, Calvin sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching and waiting. The crunch of gravel announced her arrival. He saw the familiar white SUV turning onto his lawn. And then it happened. A sharp hiss, a crunching sound as tires met the spikes. The vehicle lurched forward unevenly, and Calvin felt his chest tighten. Karen leapt from the car, heels clicking aggressively on the grass. Her face was red, eyes wide with fury. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice cutting through the crisp morning air. "This is illegal. You can't just set traps on your property." Calvin remained calm. "I think you should stop driving on my lawn," he said, steady and controlled. "It's my property, and I have the right to protect it." Karen's hands trembled with rage as she waved them at him. "I'm calling the police." "You can't do this." Calvin didn't flinch. He had anticipated this. He had pictures, videos, timestamps. He was prepared. And for the first time since moving in, he felt a surge of power. He wasn't a victim. He was a man standing his ground. Karen stomped back to her SUV, muttering threats and insults, before driving off slowly, glancing back as if daring him to pursue her. Calvin leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The morning air smelled of wet grass and faint diesel from passing cars. Quiet returned, but only for a moment. Calvin knew the battle was just beginning. Karen wouldn't give up, and neither would he. The suburban streets that once promised peace now promised conflict, and Calvin realized this wasn't just about a lawn anymore. It was about respect. dignity, justice. And next time, things would escalate. After the morning confrontation with Karen, Calvin Dunmore's life in the neighborhood shifted. It wasn't immediate, not like a lightning strike, but subtle, creeping, and unnerving. At first, he noticed glances from neighbors, quick, wary looks when he stepped outside, muffled whispers carried across the street, just beyond the reach of polite hearing, and always a lingering sense that Karen was working behind the scenes, spreading her narrative like wildfire. By midweek, Calvin realized that the situation was bigger than just one entitled neighbor. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, had been made aware of the incident. A letter arrived, crisp and formal, dropped into his mailbox like a cold, hard warning. He tore it open carefully, reading the words over and over. It has come to our attention that you have created a hazardous environment on your property. You are required to remove any and all items that pose a threat to the community, effective immediately. Failure to comply may result in fines, legal action, or further penalties. Calvin stared at the words, disbelief mingling with anger. The spikes had been a defensive measure, a statement of protection, not a weapon. And yet, the HOA framed it as dangerous, reckless, and illegal. He could feel his blood pressure rise. This wasn't just about grass anymore. It was about being painted as the problem, while the real issue, Karen's repeated trespassing, was conveniently ignored. He tried reasoning. He called the HOA office, speaking with the secretary who seemed polite but distant. "I've documented everything," Calvin explained calmly. "Photos, timestamps, video. I didn't put anyone in danger. I just wanted to protect my property from someone driving across it repeatedly." There was a pause on the line. Then, in a tone that made Calvin's stomach tighten, she replied, "I understand your perspective, Mr. Dunmore, but the HOA rules are clear. You need to remove these items immediately. Otherwise, there will be consequences." Consequences. The word hung in his mind like a warning bell. Calvin realized that this wasn't just a fight with Karen anymore. It was a clash with an entire system designed to maintain a certain order, one that often dismissed or minimized the experiences of someone like him, a black man asserting his rights in a predominantly white community. The tension escalated further when neighbors began to weigh in. Some were sympathetic, offering polite nods or quiet words of encouragement. Others were curious, gossiping about the lawn incident and whispering theories that made Calvin's skin crawl. A few, he suspected, were siding with Karen. It was as if a single act of self-defense had transformed him into a character in someone else's story, a villain in a suburban drama he never auditioned for. Calvin decided he couldn't stay silent. If he wanted to maintain his home, his dignity, and his sense of justice, he had to make his case in front of the HOA board. The next scheduled meeting was on Thursday evening, in a sterile conference room at the local community center. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the chairs were hard, unwelcoming, like they were designed for endurance rather than comfort. He arrived early, setting up a small presentation on his phone, photos of the tire tracks, videos of Karen's repeated trespassing, timestamps documenting every incident. He even included a brief timeline showing his attempts to communicate and de-escalate the situation. Calvin wanted the board to see that he hadn't acted impulsively or recklessly. He had acted out of necessity and principle. As the meeting began, Karen was seated at the front, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her head. She smiled tightly, a smugness that made Calvin's jaw clench. "I'm just here to protect my street," she said softly to the board, though Calvin could hear every word. "I don't understand why he thinks it's okay to set traps on the lawn. It's dangerous. It's unnecessary." Calvin took a deep breath. When it was his turn, he stood, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. "I planted the spikes because I was tired of repeated trespassing on my property," he said firmly. "I never intended to harm anyone. The spikes are small, non-lethal, and only intended to protect my yard. I've documented every incident. I've tried to communicate. Nothing else worked. This is about respecting boundaries." The room was silent, a tense pause stretching longer than Calvin expected. Some board members avoided his gaze. Others looked thoughtful, conflicted. Karen's smirk didn't falter. And Calvin realized that despite the evidence, some people had already made up their minds. Then came the blow. The board voted unanimously against him. They ordered the immediate removal of the spikes and threatened fines if he didn't comply. It was a crushing moment, a small victory for Karen, a public affirmation that Calvin's attempt to assert his rights had been overruled. Walking out of the meeting, Calvin felt a swirl of emotions: anger, frustration, disbelief, but also determination. He couldn't control how others perceived him, but he could control his response. He wasn't going to let this break him. As he returned home, Calvin noticed something unsettling. Karen had gathered a few neighbors on the sidewalk, her voice carrying like a whip through the quiet street. She was telling the story of the dangerous lawn traps with dramatic flair, painting herself as the victim and Calvin as the aggressor. Some neighbors nodded, others frowned, but the seed of bias had been planted. Calvin realized the situation was spiraling. It wasn't just about grass anymore. It was about perception, influence, and systemic bias. A black man defending his property was being framed as a threat, while entitlement and privilege went unchecked. The unfairness of it burned deep, but Calvin knew he had to stay focused. He began strategizing. Document everything. Record interactions. Seek allies quietly. He thought about neighbors who had shown him kindness, people who might testify to Karen's repeated trespassing. He thought about legal advice, though he wanted to avoid unnecessary confrontation. His goal was clear: protect his home, assert his rights, and expose the truth without losing his composure. That night, Calvin sat on his porch, looking over the yard he loved and defended. The spikes had been removed under the HOA's threat, leaving his lawn vulnerable once more. But Calvin's resolve hadn't wavered. He knew that standing up to Karen wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about maintaining dignity, setting boundaries, and asserting justice in a community that had already tried to silence him. Somewhere down the street, the white SUV glinted in the dim light of a passing street lamp. Calvin knew Karen hadn't given up, and neither could he. The conflict was escalating, and the stakes were higher than ever. The neighborhood had transformed from a peaceful suburban setting into a stage where pride, entitlement, and justice would collide. As the wind rustled through the trees, Calvin's mind raced. He had to be careful, strategic, calm. Every move would count. And though the board had ruled against him this time, he understood one thing clearly: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Something bigger was coming, and Calvin knew he had to be ready for it. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. Calvin Dunmore felt it in every step he took along the sidewalks, in the whispers that followed him when he checked the mailbox, in the cold stares from neighbors who had once smiled politely. The HOA had ruled against him. Karen had painted herself as the victim, and the community seemed to be shifting in her favor. But Calvin refused to let that defeat define him. He knew that the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. One evening, Calvin was trimming the bushes near the edge of his yard when he noticed something unusual. A small camera mounted discreetly on a lamppost across the street, pointed directly at his home. At first, he thought it was a security camera, maybe a neighbor monitoring their property. But the angle, the focus, the timing, it was clear that someone was watching him. And not just watching, waiting. A chill ran down his spine. He knew immediately who it was. Karen. He'd seen her pull out her phone, pretending to take photos of flowers or her own mailbox, while actually documenting his every move. She was preparing her next attack, and Calvin realized this wasn't just about the lawn anymore. It was about power, influence, and control. That night, he called his friend Marcus, a longtime confidant who had a keen understanding of the law and a sharp sense of strategy. "Marcus," Calvin said, pacing in his living room, "she's escalating. It's not just the lawn now. She's recording me, monitoring my property, and I'm pretty sure she's planning something bigger." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing. "Calvin, you have to be careful. Document everything, every interaction, every move. She's building a case, and if she convinces the HOA or the neighbors that you're dangerous, you could be in serious trouble." "I know," Calvin said, frustration threading his voice, "but I can't just sit here. I've tried reasoning. I've followed the rules. She's relentless. Marcus paused. Then it's time to be smart. Don't escalate recklessly. Protect your property legally. And if she tries to cross the line, make sure you have proof to back yourself up. Calvin nodded, determination settling like steel in his chest. He knew he had to act carefully, but decisively. And the opportunity came sooner than he expected. The next morning, as Calvin stepped onto his porch with a cup of coffee, he noticed Karen's SUV parked conspicuously at the end of his street. Her phone was out, filming his house again. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 other HOA members, people he barely knew, stood beside her, watching, whispering, nodding. It was no longer a personal vendetta. It was an organized effort, a coalition against him. Calvin felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed a plan. If he acted impulsively, he could lose everything. But if he played this correctly, he could turn the tables. He retreated into his house, retrieved the evidence he had been collecting over the past few weeks, photos, videos, timestamps, and began cataloging them meticulously. Every tire mark, every confrontation, every trespass was documented. By mid-afternoon, Calvin had a full dossier ready. It was comprehensive, undeniable, and painted a picture that no HOA member or neighbor could easily dismiss. But he also realized he needed more than proof. He needed leverage. And the key came from an unexpected source. His next-door neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She had been watching the situation quietly, uncomfortable with Karen's aggression, but hesitant to speak up. Calvin approached her carefully that evening. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said, "I know you've seen what's been happening with Karen. I need your help. I'm not trying to start trouble. I just want my property respected." She hesitated, glancing nervously toward the end of the street. "I've seen everything," she admitted softly, "and I don't like it. But I'm just one voice. No one listens to me anymore." "You don't have to do it alone," Calvin said. "We can show the HOA the truth. Your testimony, combined with my evidence, could make a real difference." After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. I want to see justice too." With Mrs. Alvarez's support, Calvin now had both evidence and witness testimony. But he also knew Karen wouldn't back down quietly. And sure enough, the very next day, Karen escalated again. She confronted him in person, standing at the edge of his property, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding the fury in her eyes. "You think you're clever," she sneered, "but the HOA isn't on your side. You can't win this." Calvin met her gaze steadily. "I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to protect what's mine. And if you keep disrespecting it, there will be consequences." Karen's lips curled into a tight, mocking smile. "Consequences? You're just a man hiding behind a lawn. Watch your back, Calvin. I have friends in high places." That was the moment Calvin realized this wasn't just about property. It was about power. Karen had influence, connections, and an unshakable sense of entitlement. But Calvin had something equally important: truth, evidence, and the moral high ground. Over the next few days, Calvin prepared carefully. He spoke with Marcus about the legalities of surveillance cameras, spoke with Mrs. Alvarez to ensure she was ready to testify, and even reached out to a lawyer for advice on documenting harassment and trespassing. Every step was calculated, every detail considered. He couldn't afford mistakes. Then came the turning point. Calvin discovered that Karen had been secretly filming the yard for weeks, uploading clips to a private HOA group chat with commentary designed to make him look unreasonable. But in doing so, she had inadvertently captured her own behavior on camera, driving repeatedly over Calvin's lawn, ignoring polite requests, and even laughing as the tires tore through the grass. This was it, the proof he needed. The narrative she had been trying to construct about him as the aggressor could now be dismantled. Calvin compiled the footage, added his documentation, and prepared a presentation for the next HOA meeting. This wasn't just defense anymore, it was a counterattack, a chance to turn the tables and finally assert his rights in a way that couldn't be ignored. That night, as he reviewed the files on his laptop, Calvin felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time, he could see a path forward. Karen's attempts to intimidate him, to control the narrative, had backfired. And when the host saw the full truth, there would be no denying it. But Calvin also knew this was dangerous. Karen was unpredictable, vindictive, and relentless. She could try anything: more harassment, false complaints, even legal threats. Every move had to be measured, every step carefully planned. As he closed his laptop and looked out at the quiet street, the SUV long gone, Calvin allowed himself a small, determined smile. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt hope. Hope that justice could be served. Hope that his dignity and the truth could prevail. And deep down, Calvin knew one thing for certain: the next confrontation would change everything. The power dynamic had shifted. Karen had pushed too far, and Calvin was ready to respond, not with anger, but with strategy, evidence, and the unshakable belief that no one could trample his rights without consequence. The stage was set. The pieces were in motion, and the suburban neighborhood that had once seemed peaceful now teetered on the edge of something explosive. Calvin Dunmore knew the next few weeks would define everything. Karen hadn't backed down, and now her influence in the HOA and among the neighbors was spreading like wildfire. Every glance, every whispered conversation across the street reminded him that this wasn't just a personal feud anymore. It had become a social battlefield. The stakes weren't just his lawn or his home. They were his dignity, his rights, and the principle of respect in a community that should have welcomed him. He started early that week by preparing his home, but not just for protection. He prepared it for evidence. Every tire mark, every trace of prior trespassing, and even small disturbances in the yard were documented with meticulous care. Calvin had cameras discreetly set up at angles covering every vulnerable part of his property. Some were visible, intended as a deterrent. Others were hidden, to catch anyone attempting to manipulate the situation or fabricate events. He reviewed hours of footage, noting patterns in Karen's movements, times, and interactions with neighbors. But Calvin knew cameras alone weren't enough. He needed allies. His first call was to Mrs. Alvarez, his elderly neighbor who had witnessed multiple confrontations. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said gently, "I know you've seen Karen's behavior firsthand. I need your support at the next HOA meeting. Your voice matters. You can help me show the truth." She hesitated at first, glancing nervously toward the street. "I've never liked conflict," she whispered. "But, yes, I'll speak up. For you. For what's right." Calvin felt a surge of gratitude. With her testimony and the video evidence he had compiled, he now had a chance to expose Karen's repeated trespassing in a way the HOA couldn't ignore. He reached out quietly to a few more neighbors who had expressed concern over Karen's actions. Some were hesitant, afraid of backlash. Others were curious but cautious. Slowly, Calvin began building a small but solid coalition, people willing to speak truth to power, even if it made them uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Karen was escalating. She had begun driving past Calvin's house at odd hours, sometimes slowly circling the block, pretending to check mail or deliveries, but clearly monitoring the property. Calvin documented everything, but he also felt a growing tension in the neighborhood. Whispers turned into pointed questions when neighbors passed by. "Did you see Calvin's lawn traps?" Someone would say, "That's dangerous." Another would shake their head and comment on how the HOA had to intervene. Calvin realized that perception was just as important as truth. To counter this, Calvin created a strategy. He would present everything in the next HOA meeting, not just the Spikes incident, but the pattern of harassment, the evidence of trespassing, and witness testimony. But he also knew he had to anticipate Karen's moves. She would likely claim he was overreacting, that the Spikes were a danger, and that he had violated community rules. Calvin prepared counterpoints, legal references, and even showed photographs of how the Spikes were small, shallow, and non-lethal, a defensive measure rather than a trap. The night before the meeting, Calvin couldn't sleep. His mind raced with scenarios. Karen storming the room, neighbors turning against him, the HOA dismissing his evidence. Yet, alongside the anxiety, there was a simmering determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for dignity, for respect, and for a precedent that no one, especially someone entitled and aggressive, could walk over him or his property without consequence. The day of the whole meeting arrived. Calvin double-checked his camera placements, organized his notes, and rehearsed what he would say. He wanted to appear calm, measured, and credible. This wasn't about emotion. It was about facts, evidence, and justice. As he entered the meeting room, Karen was already there, leaning against the wall with that same smug expression, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She had a small group of supporters with her, whispering and smirking. Calvin's stomach tightened, but he refused to let intimidation shake him. The meeting began with routine HOA business, approvals of landscaping changes and community announcements, before finally moving to the Calvin Dunmore property dispute. The room fell into silence as Karen and Calvin faced each other across the long table. The tension was palpable, so thick you could almost touch it. Karen spoke first, her tone controlled but sharp. "I've tried to address this politely, but Mr. Dunmore has set traps on his lawn. It's a danger to the community. I believe the HOA must take action immediately." She spoke as though narrating a story where she was the victim and Calvin was the aggressor. Every word was carefully chosen to evoke fear and outrage. Then it was Calvin's turn. He rose slowly, holding his folder tightly, taking a deep breath. "I understand your concern," he began, his voice calm but authoritative. "However, what's being presented here omits critical context. This is not an act of aggression. It's a response to repeated trespassing on my property. I have documented instances of repeated entry, tire marks, and disrespectful behavior. The spikes were small, defensive, and intended to prevent further trespassing without causing harm." He presented the evidence: photos, timestamps, video clips of Karen driving over his yard, and even clips of her laughing as she tore through the grass. He showed the board the careful setup of the spikes, how they were shallow, not dangerous, and entirely for protection. Then Mrs. Alvarez spoke, describing what she had witnessed firsthand, her voice steady despite nerves. She recounted the repeated violations and emphasized Calvin's measured response, noting that he had tried reasoning, communication, and patience before taking defensive action. The room murmured. Board members whispered among themselves, clearly processing the new information. Even some of Karen's supporters shifted uncomfortably. Calvin could feel the momentum starting to turn. He kept his composure, answering questions with calm precision, refusing to be baited into emotion or confrontation. Karen tried one last tactic, raising her voice slightly, accusing Calvin of intimidation and hostile behavior. But by now, the room had seen the truth. Her claims were undermined by the evidence, the testimony, and the timeline of repeated trespassing. Calvin had transformed from the perceived aggressor into the voice of reason and justice. As the meeting adjourned, the board promised to review all evidence carefully. Calvin stepped outside into the cool evening air, chest heaving, mind racing. He had taken a significant step forward, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Karen would retaliate. He was sure of it. But he had something she lacked: preparation, truth, and the moral high ground. That night, Calvin walked around his yard, inspecting the grass and imagining what would come next. Karen was relentless, but so was he. He felt a new level of confidence. He had taken the first steps in reclaiming his power, asserting his rights, and proving that dignity could not be trampled by entitlement. And deep down, he knew the coming confrontation would be decisive. It wouldn't just be a battle over a lawn anymore. It would be a fight for justice, for recognition, and for respect. And Calvin was ready to see it through. The day of reckoning had arrived. Calvin Dunmore could feel it in his bones. The tension in the air was almost tangible, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The confrontation that had been simmering for weeks was about to explode, and there was no turning back. Every late-night preparation, every careful document, every camera angle and witness testimony had led to this moment. Karen arrived early, the white SUV gleaming in the morning sun. She stepped out with the same confident swagger, sunglasses perched perfectly, lips curled in that tight, superior smile. Behind her, a small group of HOA supporters whispered, their eyes scanning Calvin's property with judgment. Calvin's chest tightened, but he refused to show fear. This wasn't about intimidation anymore, it was about truth, evidence, and standing firm in the face of entitlement. As the HOA representatives arrived, the room was charged with anticipation. Chairs scraped on the polished floors. The murmur of voices filled the air, punctuated by the occasional cough or shuffle of papers. Calvin set up his materials, reviewing the timeline of events one last time. Every detail had to be perfect. Every piece of evidence had to speak louder than Karen's words. The meeting began, and the board president called the session to order. We're here today to address the ongoing dispute between Mr. Dunmore and Ms. Karen. We will review all evidence and hear statements before making a decision. Karen jumped in immediately, her tone sharp, rehearsed. Mr. Dunmore has set traps on his property, endangering the community. He has acted recklessly and aggressively. The HOA must intervene to prevent further incidents. She spoke as though narrating a story she wanted everyone to believe, one where she was the victim, calm and reasonable, and Calvin was a threat. Calvin took a deep breath, letting the room settle before speaking. I understand the concern, he began evenly. But let's be clear. The traps were small spikes placed to protect my property after repeated, documented trespassing. I have evidence of multiple instances where my lawn was intentionally damaged. This was not reckless. It was defensive, measured, and legal. I have photographs, videos, timestamps, and witnesses who can confirm the pattern. He presented the evidence, starting with photos of tire tracks cutting through his lawn, video clips of Karen driving over the grass repeatedly, and timestamps showing dates and times of each trespass. Mrs. Alvarez's testimony followed, steady and confident, detailing what she had seen and emphasizing that Calvin had attempted to resolve the situation peacefully before taking any action. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Board members whispered among themselves, some nodding slightly, others furrowing their brows in thought. Karen's smug expression wavered for the first time, a flicker of concern crossing her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but Calvin anticipated her attack and calmly presented more evidence. Video footage of Karen laughing as she tore through the lawn, screenshots of her private HOA group posts where she exaggerated the danger and painted him as aggressive, and meticulous records showing that Calvin had always acted within legal bounds. One board member leaned forward. This is compelling, she said, glancing at her notes. The documentation clearly shows repeated trespassing and attempts at communication. Mr. Dunmore appears to have acted in defense of his property, not maliciously. Karen's voice rose in frustration. This is ridiculous. He can't just set traps on his lawn. What if someone had been seriously hurt? Calvin's tone remained calm, authoritative. The spikes were shallow, non-lethal, and carefully placed to prevent trespassing without causing harm. There was never any intent to injure anyone. The real danger was from repeated, intentional violations of my property by Ms. Karen. The room went silent. For the first time, the truth was undeniable, staring everyone in the face. Calvin had transformed from the perceived aggressor to the one who had been wronged. The moral and legal high ground was his. Karen's oral superiority began to crumble, her body language stiff and defensive. The whispers from her supporters faded as board members took notes, clearly reconsidering the narrative they had initially accepted. Then came the final piece of evidence. Footage from hidden cameras showing Karen driving over the lawn early one morning, ignoring polite notes left on her windshield, and even making comments to passersby about how Dunmore was overreacting. The board members exchanged glances, and Calvin knew the tide had turned decisively. The board president cleared her throat. Given the evidence presented, she said slowly, it is clear that Mr. Dunmore has acted responsibly in defending his property. The repeated trespassing by Ms. Karen is documented and undeniable. We find that no violation on Mr. Dunmore's part has occurred, and further, we recommend that the HOA address the pattern of trespassing to prevent future incidents. Calvin felt a rush of relief and triumph. The months of stress, frustration, and careful preparation had culminated in this moment. Justice had been served, not through confrontation or anger, but through diligence, preparation, and steadfastness. Karen's face went pale. She opened her mouth, But no words came out. Her supporters shifted uncomfortably, whispers turning to murmurs of disbelief. She stormed out of the room, muttering threats under her breath, leaving Calvin standing with a quiet sense of vindication. Outside, the air was crisp and still. Calvin stepped onto the porch of his home, feeling the weight of weeks of tension begin to lift. The street looked the same, the sun casting golden light over the familiar rows of houses. But to Calvin, everything had changed. He had faced intimidation, entitlement, and systemic bias, and he had emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for the principle of standing up for what is right. Neighbors who had watched cautiously from their windows began to approach. Some offered hesitant congratulations. Others nodded in quiet respect. Mrs. Alvarez smiled warmly. "You did it, Calvin," she said. "You showed them all that doing what's right takes courage and patience." Calvin nodded, a sense of calm pride washing over him. He knew this wasn't the end. Karen might try to retaliate. Whispers might continue, but he had set a precedent. He had proven that boundaries, respect, and dignity mattered, and that one person, armed with evidence and resolve, could stand up against entitlement and aggression. That evening, Calvin walked around his yard, inspecting the grass that had been the battleground for weeks. The lawn was scarred in places, yes, but it stood as a testament to his perseverance. Every blade of grass felt like a small victory, a symbol of justice, and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be bullied into submission. As the sun set, Calvin reflected on the journey. He had been tested in ways he never imagined when he bought this home, but he had faced it with calm determination, careful planning, and unwavering principles. The climax of this conflict had arrived, and he had not only survived, it had been a decisive win. And deep down, Calvin knew that this was bigger than a lawn, a neighbor, or even an HOA. This was about standing up for what is right, asserting dignity, and showing that justice is possible even when the odds seem stacked against you. For Calvin Dunmore, the battlefield had been the lawn. The victory was justice, and the lesson that courage, evidence, and perseverance could overcome arrogance and entitlement would stay with him forever. The whole meeting had ended, but the echoes of that confrontation reverberated throughout the neighborhood. Calvin Dunmore could feel it in the subtle shifts, the way neighbors glanced at him differently, the soft nods of respect from those who had been on the fence, and the silence from others who had once whispered judgment. The battle was over, but the aftermath was a delicate web he had to navigate carefully. Karen's retreat was dramatic but predictable. She stormed out of the whole room that afternoon, muttering under her breath, her SUV's tires crunching on gravel like a drumbeat of frustration. Calvin had anticipated her reaction. He didn't chase her, didn't respond to her threats. Instead, he stayed calm, knowing that any reaction could be twisted or used against him. He had won the confrontation through preparation and patience, and he wasn't about to compromise that victory. Back at home, Calvin began the slow process of repairing his yard. The grass had been torn and trampled over weeks of conflict, and while the spikes had been removed, the evidence of Karen's repeated trespassing remained visible. He mowed the lawn meticulously, replanting patches, and carefully smoothing over the soil. Every repair felt symbolic, a restoration not just of his property, but of his peace of mind. The neighborhood itself began to shift. Some neighbors approached cautiously, offering congratulations or simply a nod of respect. "I saw what happened at the HOA," one neighbor, Mr. Thompson, said quietly. "You handled it well. I think some of us underestimated how serious this was." Calvin nodded, acknowledging the gesture without comment. He appreciated the support, but knew that words alone couldn't erase weeks of tension. Others, however, were less forgiving. Karen's supporters had not given up, and whispers persisted, quiet accusations about reckless behavior or overreacting. Calvin recognized that changing perception took time, even when the truth was on his side. He refused to engage in petty arguments. Instead, he relied on the strength of evidence and patience. Over time, the facts would speak louder than rumors. One afternoon, Calvin received a call from Marcus. "How's everything?" Marcus asked, concern in his voice. "You've been through a lot." "I'm adjusting," Calvin admitted. The whole ruling was in my favor, but the tension hasn't fully dissipated. People are still talking. Karen isn't going to disappear quietly. Marcus chuckled softly. That's true, but you did what needed to be done. You documented everything, stayed calm, and presented your case flawlessly. That counts for more than you realize. Calvin felt a small smile tug at his lips. It's just exhausting. I didn't expect standing up for my property would take this much energy. It's not just your property, Marcus reminded him. It's your dignity, your rights, and your voice in the community. You set a precedent. That's bigger than a lawn. Calvin let that sink in. He realized Marcus was right. The battle over the lawn had become a microcosm of something much larger, standing up against entitlement, bias, and aggression. It wasn't about winning a single argument. It was about asserting justice in a world that often overlooked or dismissed it. That weekend, Calvin hosted a small gathering with neighbors who had supported him. It was informal. A few chairs on the porch, iced tea, and quiet conversation. Mrs. Alvarez was there, smiling warmly. You were calm, clear, and prepared, she said. You showed all of us what it means to stand up without losing your composure. That's inspiring. Calvin nodded, grateful for the support. I couldn't have done it alone. Your testimony mattered. Every piece of evidence mattered. But most of all, staying calm and focusing on truth mattered. The gathering was a turning point. Slowly, the neighborhood began to recalibrate. Neighbors who had once whispered doubt now viewed Calvin with respect. Some even apologized for their earlier assumptions, admitting that they had been swayed by Karen's narrative. The subtle social power shift was underway. Calvin's patience and diligence had begun to reshape perceptions. Karen, predictably, did not go quietly. Rumors persisted, and she occasionally tried to provoke reactions. One morning, Calvin noticed her SUV parked a little too long on the street, phone out, filming his yard. But instead of confronting her, he documented the incident silently, letting evidence continue to speak for itself. He had learned that reacting emotionally played into her hands. Calm, methodical responses were his most powerful tools. At work, Calvin reflected on the experience. He had been tested in ways he never anticipated: harassment, public judgment, and systemic bias. But he had remained composed, strategic, and resilient. The conflict had stretched him, forced him to think critically and act decisively. And in doing so, he realized that the lessons extended far beyond the neighborhood. They were lessons in justice, self-respect, and empowerment. Even as tension persisted in small pockets, Calvin found peace in the everyday rhythms of life. Mowing the lawn, watering the flowers, and waving to neighbors became acts of quiet defiance, a statement that life went on, that dignity could be maintained, and that justice, when pursued methodically, could prevail. One afternoon, Calvin received a note slipped under his door. It was from a neighbor who had been silent throughout the conflict. I wanted to say, I'm sorry for doubting you. You handled everything with dignity. Thank you for showing us the right way. Calvin smiled, tucking the note into his pocket. It was a small but meaningful acknowledgement of the impact he had made. As the weeks passed, Karen's influence began to wane. The HOA, having reviewed all evidence, issued a formal statement confirming that Calvin's actions had been defensive and within his rights. While she grumbled and complained privately, the formal record was clear. Calvin's victory had been recognized, and the pattern of harassment had no legal standing. Standing on his porch one evening, watching the sun set behind the oak trees, Calvin reflected on the journey. He had been tested, challenged, and underestimated. Yet through preparation, calm determination, and unwavering adherence to truth, he had emerged victorious. The neighborhood's subtle shift in attitude was proof that justice could prevail, even when faced with aggression and entitlement. He realized the importance of community as well. Mrs. Alvarez's willingness to speak up, Marcus's guidance, and the support of other neighbors had made the difference. Justice, Calvin understood, was not just about individual action. It was about collective courage and integrity. And while Karen's presence remained a minor tension in the background, Calvin felt confident in his ability to maintain peace. He had established boundaries, documented evidence, and set a precedent that would influence future interactions. The lawn, once a battlefield, had become a symbol of resilience, patience, and empowerment. As twilight descended, Calvin took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, clean air of the neighborhood he had fought to protect. The conflict had tested him in every way imaginable, but it had also revealed his strength, his strategic mind, and his unwavering commitment to justice. The immediate storm had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. Calvin knew the story wasn't over. Karen might still attempt small provocations, and whispers might continue, but he had weathered the climax, set a precedent, and reclaimed his dignity. And in that quiet moment, standing on his porch with the sky painted in hues of orange and purple, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He had faced aggression, entitlement, and systemic bias, and he had emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, wiser, and more empowered than ever before. The weeks following the HOA's ruling brought a slow, deliberate calm to Calvin Dunmore's neighborhood. The immediate storm had passed, leaving behind quiet streets, repaired lawns, and a sense of stability. But it wasn't just about the lawn anymore. The conflict had rippled outward, affecting people in unexpected ways, bringing clarity, reflection, and closure to those who had been caught in the tension. Calvin had begun to notice changes in his neighbors. Mrs. Alvarez, once hesitant and cautious, now walked her dog with a renewed sense of confidence. She would stop to greet Calvin, offering words of encouragement and support. "You taught us all something important," she said one afternoon, pausing on the sidewalk. "Standing up doesn't have to mean fighting. It can mean being prepared, patient, and true to yourself." Calvin smiled. Her words resonated deeply. They reminded him that victory wasn't always loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, steady, and rooted in integrity. The ripples of his actions had encouraged others to reflect on their own choices, to question assumptions, and to stand up for what was right in their own ways. Other neighbors, who had once whispered judgment or stayed silent, began to engage differently. Some offered apologies, acknowledging that they had been swayed by Karen's narrative or had failed to see the full picture. "I didn't understand everything that was happening," one neighbor admitted.